Hello class, welcome to our presentation on the interplay of genes and personality by Alex Osborne, Haley Ohlson, and Jensen Oppio. The purpose of our literature review was to find out how and to what extent do genetics influence personality and its specific components.
And the problem we saw initially with that question specifically was assessing exactly to what degree personality affected genes, as well as the impact environment had on personality and its components. We knew going into this that genes and environment both played a role in personality, but we didn't really understand to what extent each had. A little bit of background on our literature review. Eric Turkheimer has 3 laws for behavior genetics of personality. The first being that all behavioral traits are heritable. The second being the effect of shared environments is less than the effect of genetics. And the third being heritability as a whole cannot be completely accounted for by either genetics or environmental factors. In our literature review, we really tried to find studies and write about how these laws were either supported or discounted by the information that we were finding. A little bit more background. So a study that really pioneered its way of defining personality and helping the psychological sciences define personality was the study by Heston in 1966, where this study took schizophrenic mothers and their offspring who were adopted out and did not live with them while they were growing up. And they saw a high incidence of schizophrenia, or a higher incidence of schizophrenia in these offspring than the general population, showing that genetics really did play a role in specific personality disorders such as schizophrenia. And this really pioneered a shift away from the idea in the psychological field that environment was the key determinant of personality, and it started to include genes and genetic components as well.
Diving into our studies, the first that we looked at was by Lowe et al. In 2017, and they had an in-depth look at influence of individual genes on personality development. The goal of their study was to correlate known single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, with personality traits defined by the 5-factor model and 6 central mental illnesses, specifically bipolar depression, ADHD, anorexia, autism, and schizophrenia. And so basically they were correlating the prevalence of those 5 personality traits with the prevalence of those 6 mental disorders. And they already knew about a prominent SNP for neuroticism and extroversion, respectively. And this study found a high correlation between the expression of neuroticism SNPs with depression and the expression of extroversion SNPs with ADHD. And so this really shows the importance of using SNPs and genome-wide association studies as methods of determining the molecular genetic impact on personality. And taking a step out, this Kruger study in 2000 wanted to find the genetic environmental correlation between monozygotic and dizygotic twins on their performance on this multidimensional personality questionnaire. And the goal was to analyze the structure of normal range personality traits instead of personality disorder traits. And this study found barely significant differences between the genetic effects and the environmental effects for each of the correlations, which suggests that maybe genetics doesn't have as much of influence as much as we thought, or that environmental effects have a greater significance than we expected.
Another study that we looked at was conducted by Rishku and colleagues, and this study sought to draw a correlation between variations in tryptophan hydroxylase, TPH, and aggression-related traits. TPH specifically is an enzyme that regulates levels of serotonin in the body and in specifically the serogenetic system, which affects a wide range of activity and behaviors. Aggression-related traits. The researchers in the study knew before and postulated that aggression-related traits correlated inversely with the serogenetic system, meaning that the higher activity that the serogenetic system had, the less of an incidence of aggression-related traits they saw in individuals, and the inverse also being true. So the lower the activity of the serogenetic system, the higher the incidence of aggression-related traits they saw in individuals. The researchers found a clear association between two specific SNPs on TPH, A218C and A779C, with aggression-related traits, and this really went to show that genes do play a role in specific personality dimensions such as aggression, and the mutations within specific genes could be found to have an effect on specific personality dimensions such as aggression.
In another study that we looked at, Lively and colleagues, they studied the genetic and environmental contributions to dimensions of personality disorder. The main point of this study was to see which traits may exist on a spectrum, with some traits having higher heritability than others. And the goal of this twin study was to investigate the genetic and environmental contributions of 18 personality disorder traits using the dimensional assessment of personality pathology in the ACE model, which is additive effects, shared environment, and non-shared environmental effects. Before this study assessed heritability, they made sure the effects of gender and age were removed and that it was equal environment's assumption. The results of this study showed that genetics have the greatest influence over which traits were heritable over non-shared environmental effects and shared environmental influences, which appeared to have little to no effect. In another study that also started to map human behavior, Weincheck and colleagues studied the relationship between genes, personality traits, and political interest. The main point of this study was to correlate political interest to the big 5 personality traits and look into how much genetics accounts for the variance within these traits. The goal of this study ultimately allows us to have great insight to our society, and from there we can postulate and predict how and who will engage in our community. This study also used the ACE model as before, and they found that genetic factors account for a fairly large proportion of the correlation between political interest and the big 5 personality traits, with rigidity and conflict avoidance having a negative and significant effect on interest, and aggressiveness and altruism having a positive and significant effect on political interest, which makes sense based off these definitions. And their study also found that genetic factors account for 50% of total correlation between these, which just shows how important genetic factors is for political interest, which is a very heavy topic right now. And the largest correlation they found was between openness and political interest.
Overall, I think this literature review left us with more questions than answers, but ultimately it did support Turkheimer's 3 laws of behavior genetics, even though I think it's a little bit rash to really call them laws because there's so much that we don't know about personality and its genetic effects. But it does leave us with some questions for future direction, such as understanding how the products of genes are expressed as specific personality phenotypes. So if we found a gene that produced a protein that made you neurotic, that would tell us a lot about how the molecular genetic aspect is influencing our expression of personality. And also, a lot of our studies we found were only had a limited participant pool, and so in order to generalize specific findings of personality, it would be really beneficial to target a broader participant population in order to extrapolate to a general population. And here are our references. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.